How you doing? Welcome to The Movers. I'm Sinead Gillett.
And I'm Philip Macartney.
Today, folks, we want to talk about something that most of us have experienced at some stage in our working lives, and that is the daily commute.
Now, Sinead, before we get stuck in, because this is something we've both been quite passionate about, working in the mobility industry, mobility structured podcast, mobility focused podcast. We're both sort of quite passionate about this. But before we get into the serious meat of this, tell me about your worst commuting memory. Like, where was it bad for you?
When I used to work in the city centre, this is about 7-8 years ago, I worked on Dame Street with my pal Orla, and I was in Dublin. It's Dame Street in Dublin. We had an office there. I was a serial fainter. If I got on a dart, I just did it all the time. If I got on a dart, and I used to get on at Clongriffin station, which is about 8 stops from the city centre, and it was already full because this would be at peak times, and I had to stand and I had all my layers on, and no matter what, windows open, full belly full of food, just keel over and faint. I have to get out.
Did you
off
do
the
it
train.
like a dramatic swoon?
I do it.
Was
I
it
do
a
it.
dramatic
I'm known
swoon?
for doing it at funerals as well, where you have to stand at the back. So that's not a good commute experience. That happened to me lots of times.
I hated
What
people
about
like
you?
you. So I worked in London for about 4 or 5 years, and I lived in Clapham Common, and it was a very busy northern line into like Bank and Oxford Street and stuff like this. So it was very sort of crammed in, and you kind of get used to it. So there was a hot summer's day, 7:35 tube, whatever it was. I get in there and I'm standing up, and I'm always quite conscious. I'm a big guy, I'm just trying to just not get in people's way. It's only 2 stops to the blue bullet on the other line. And I'm like, just take the northern line for 2 stops. You'll be fine. And by the way, my wife knows this story.
This is going to be better than I thought.
I know. It's good.
This
it's
is one of
good.
these personal
my wife knows
folklore.
this story. So I get in, and you're all rammed together, and this particularly attractive girl is standing right in front of me, and she's talking to her equally attractive friend. And I sort of noted it. I've got my hand up and the thing, we're all rammed in. Then she sort of leaned her head into my chest. And I was like, okay, this is weird, but it's only 2 stops. That's fine. We pulled into the tunnel, moved off. We pulled into the tunnel, and the train broke down. And I was like, okay, this always happens. It'll take 2 seconds. And then her and what I thought was her friend, started kissing quite passionately while she lay on my chest. And I'm now like, okay, how do you deal with this situation?
Mattress. You're a vertical mattress.
And I'm like, this is super weird. And I catch this guy's eye, and he is crying, laughing at me, right? And all he is mouthing at me is, don't fucking move. And then I start laughing, and I try not to move because these girls are obviously having a moment on me. Yeah, that was a particularly challenging commute, let's say. I facilitated them, fill the mattress. Anyway, so let's get on to the commute in general. Will we start with the history of commuting?
I think so, right? Because the history of the commute, or the evolution of the commute, dates all the way back in time. We can go a long, long, long way back. But it's also inherently connected to the development of our cities and towns. You can't have cities without transportation infrastructure. And it's very interesting when you trace it all the way back, how we can talk about transport, but how it ultimately tells the story of how civilization has unfolded. The way we look at urban development is the faster transportation gets, the bigger the city can spread. So your time to commute has a direct impact on how far away from the city centre you can live. And that's how we can look at how urban cities have been designed.
I get this. And we all have this inherent need to sort of think of things in terms of a half hour. So in 1994, there was a guy called Macartney. If I'm butchering that Italian, let me know. But he was an Italian physicist. And he came up with this thing called the Macartney constant. And he declared in this that most people have been willing to commute for about half an hour one way from their homes each day. And I think we all kind of think like that in today's world. It's maybe 26 minutes in the US, 28 minutes in Europe, but we all kind of think in that, I want to live within half an hour. Anything longer than that seems a bit too much. And that's a constant throughout the world.
I think that makes sense. And you can see how that can go off the rails at some points. When you see, for example, the objective or the value people place on in Ireland owning your own home versus the value of a 30-minute commute. And they came up massively in conflict with each other over the last 10 or 20 years. And you get this spread, these satellite towns that are too far away from the city centre. And it causes a lot of problems for people, and housing prices and everything kind of surge up. But we're not going to talk about that one today, because that would be opening a huge can of worms. 30-minute commute. If you go all the way back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the cities are 1 mile, 2 square miles. They're tiny, but there's a lot of people living within those boundaries. So 30 minutes to get anywhere in that city, it makes a lot of sense. Nothing really changes in terms of commuting. I mean, back then, there isn't the commute the way we see it now. Most people are commuting to trade at a marketplace. They're probably working within their home to create the products, or if they're outside, they're agricultural. You go into 1600s, you're kind of Middle Ages now, you're still have a lot of agricultural work, and there isn't a huge change in the commute other than we start to see the emergence of public transport in the form of horse and carts. Paris, for example. But there was a big problem with those. Can you think of what it is?
I have no idea.
Stink.
Other than
They stunk.
shit.
They stunk up the cities and the towns. Yeah, exactly. So horse shit everywhere. And also, they weren't any faster. You could walk around the city as quickly as you could do a horse and cart because of the amount of people walking on the streets, and they weren't dedicated to horse and carts the way we see roads dedicated to cars now. So took pretty much as long as walking, and really they were for people who had big burdens to carry. It wasn't until the industrial age that we start to see a change in how people commute. Big social change. We now have manufacturing plants based in cities. For people who worked on farms, this is creating a new option to work on non-seasonal work. So people can now work 12 months in a year. They flood the cities and towns to be able to avail of this more consistent, reliable work. And so the cities and towns become absolutely overpopulated. We're talking, the tenement horrors that you've heard of, the rats and the epidemics and all that kind of stuff. So big, big problem. And we need to find ways for people.
Sort of stuff.
Oh, totally.
It's Charles Dickens, isn't it? Yeah. And so what were they using like in those 1800s? That was, had bicycles really taken off by that sort of stage, or where were we then?
Sort of. So the bike is actually quite interesting, because the bike as we know it now in its current design, well, its most used design now is about 1885, but there was variations of the bike from about 1817 onwards. And they were different iterations before they got to like a very usable piece of technology. And they had names like the Dandy, that's a bike without pedals, or the Bone Shaker, which was this yoke that apparently was the most uncomfortable thing to ride, so it just didn't work. And then the penny farthing, which is one that we probably remember most from our history books before we get to 1885, the real bike that we've based the design on now. And I guess, big shift now, you've got your electric bikes and your pedal assists and all that stuff has come in. So they made a big difference to people being able to navigate around cities very quickly, and also to get into cities from other locations. In some places, we see ferries, commuter ferries coming into play. So I've just come back from New York. I was on the Staten Island ferry. These came out early in the century, and they made a massive difference to people being able to travel into New York City from different locations and travel back out at the end of the day. Big leap forward there. But rail is really the piece that we need to talk about.
Yeah, so just on the water stuff, highly underrated in places that don't really have that water connection, highly underrated form of commuting. I did a bit of commuting using that, and it was a fantastic way to travel every morning. So rail, I think, started to come along. You had your overground rail, which allowed people to start to push in from outside of the city.
The steam train is hugely transformative for many, many places. The first intercity steam train was Liverpool to Manchester, and we saw that development connecting different cities in countries, long distance travel. But in terms of the daily commute, where we start seeing the steam train take impact is where you have a train line, a fixed route train line going into a city centre. And because the steam train is really slow to slow down, you can't just stop the way you would see like the Dart in Dublin now, for example, or an underground. It can't stop every half mile. It takes too long to slow down. And that's why you see the development of these breadcrumb villages on the way into a city centre. They're usually about 10 to 15 minutes apart on a train. And between each of these towns and villages It's pastoral, gorgeous, lovely countryside. And you still see the remnants of that now. They haven't joined up yet. And that's all down to do with the technology of the steam train taking too long to slow down.
The Underground in London, created in 1863, originally that was steam. And it was,
And
you
that
know,
had
it
a
was a great
huge
idea.
negative
Oh, no,
impact as well.
everyone was stinking. Everyone was stinking.
They were
It's
covered
so
in,
funny.
they're covered in coal dust. So imagine getting dressed for work, all lovely and gorgeous and all your lovely work clothes.
Getting off like you're singing Chim Chimney Chiru on the other side. But it's so funny. There's two evolutions, because in 1889, I think it was the electrification of London happened, and they've been electric ever since. But if you think about it, there's two evolutions where we've now talked about the smell. So, you know, the horse and cart, shit everywhere. We don't like the smell. And then getting covered with soot. It's amazing how these things are like, why are we putting up with this? But when we talk about the steam train, that is good for bringing people in. That brings people into the city. But in places like London, penny farthings and stuff like this, enough gentlemen going to work in the bank, enough of getting their testicles destroyed by the bone crusher or the dandy or whatever else.
Well, how did we just get on to talking about testicles? I thought we said we weren't going to do that anymore.
Because when you put up the bone shaker there, that was the first thing I thought of, these poor buggers riding these things on cobble streets.
The London Tube, invented by Charles Pearson, the first iteration, dirty, didn't really work. But in 1890, the electrification of the tube, this is sensational. This is going to change commute for everybody. And we start to see it then being brought out in other cities. Boston was the first city in North America, about 1897. Budapest was early, 1896. And then we see New York coming out in 1904, which really becomes a marquee for this idea of an underground.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way it evolved. The underground evolved from being like a route train to a network. I had a friend who came to London and he couldn't understand the underground, bearing in mind that the underground map is one of the most celebrated pieces of design in the world because it's so smart and people from every culture can understand the underground map. My buddy couldn't. He could not get to grips with that. And it's because he thought in such a binary way. He was like, oh no, but where does this train go? And I'm like, you cannot think of the underground in London like a train to somewhere. It's a network. And you scoop from color to color, from line to line to find your way to it. He could not wrap his head around this at all. So that evolution would have only happened with the electrification. Then you can build more lines into the underground. And then it sort of evolved into that hiving network that you see there today.
And revolutionized how people got around cities as well as getting into cities. Big change.
Huge. We're all still addicted to the car a little bit, aren't we?
We see the car coming out at the end of the 19th century, and it's kind of a plaything, isn't it, for the fat cats? So you're an aristocratic, you're loaded, you're playing around and showing off your new toy to everybody, and that's a lot of fun. But it's not until Ford popularized the car. I think this is like 1908, and everybody knows you can have whatever color you want as long as it's black. But this is the beginning of people having vehicles that are kind of the everyday, the middle class people. And that made a massive difference to people getting from A to B. However, it didn't make a huge impact on that commute time because the roads were fairly shite. Remember that they were designed for horse and carts. We had trams and what they call streetcars in America. They were also running at this point as well. But the roads weren't designed for lots of automobiles going in one direction and traffic flows and peak times. None of that was in place. So it wasn't until we start to see highways and motorways coming into play that the automobile commute really took off. We're talking about the 1950s onwards when it starts to take over, particularly in America, where we know the Americans have really embraced the car. It's the ultimate autonomy. You can get in it and go wherever you want, follow your destiny. Europe, we're a little bit more centered on public transport, which probably stands to those cities today a little bit more than some of the American cities. Something we are going to return to talk about in a few weeks' time when we discuss the World Cup in America, which I think is going to be an interesting podcast. But yeah, the car needed the road to catch up in order for it to become a real key trend for commuting.
But it's no real surprise that this happened in the 50s. So you've got the Second World War, the first highly mechanized war. Then you've got all of these. America came out of the Second World War as the superpower then. It hadn't suffered any damage like Europe. Most of Europe had been, had severe damage, had massive issues in reconstructing every part of their infrastructure, but buildings, etc. America was sitting there with the success. It had lots of people now trained in driving Jeeps and driving things. So driving was second nature to a lot of that generation that came out through the Second World War. And it's no surprise that the Americans got it right. And I put that in inverted commas because it's not for everyone. I couldn't live in the States with that amount of just constant in the car for everything. Like there's no city centers in LA and places like that. That would drive me nuts. I much prefer living in Europe.
There's a tipping point. There's a tipping point, Phil, because they got it right up until the point that the 30-minute commute was no longer reality because of traffic congestion.
Well, that's sure. In California, you're talking people doing 400 plus miles commutes round trip in Silicon Valley every week. How is that living? That's like 200 miles. So that's what, 3 hours in the car every morning, 3 hours back. Good luck.
But that's a long distance commute that they're doing. I'm talking about traffic congestion where you really do live 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers from where you want to go and you're stuck in traffic, which is way more frustrating.
Dublin.
That is Dublin. That's way, way more frustrating. Atlanta is notorious for its traffic. I was there recently. We were trying to meet up with a work colleague. She kept saying, no, we can't. No, the traffic's too bad. We're like, well, we're in Atlanta from Dublin. Can we not meet you? She's like, you don't have time. The flight's 5 hours. No, the traffic's too bad. She just couldn't meet us in Atlanta because of the fact that the traffic congestion was just simply too bad to facilitate it, even though we traveled all the way from Dublin, not to see these colleagues, but happened to be in Atlanta. And that's a real problem there.
It's good that Atlanta doesn't have any Disney big fairgrounds or anything like that, because that seems to be the thing that you do every work trip that you go on.
The Movers podcast is brought to you by Moovex, the most advanced route optimization platform available today. Go to Moovex.ai. That's Moovex.ai.
The inner city commute, and you can see it. London is actually surrounded by, I think it's the M25. And inside that M25 compared to outside that M25 is almost two different worlds. Like when you see that flow of traffic into exactly what you said, like old streets designed for horse and carts. And some of London's obviously a lot better, but when you see it coming into the center, you can see why they've got that ring around London that charges you congestion charging and stuff like that, because London just can't function with that amount of traffic. It just doesn't work.
Let me ask you, Phil, a quiz question for you. What is the next big technological development that has impacted on the evolution of the commute?
I'm scared to answer this. I have my ideas, but it sounds like this is a question you've already got the answer to.
Cloud computing.
Explain yourself.
So the commute has been, for some people, removed because of the ability to work remotely using cloud technology. Big impact on how people are moving around the world and how people are accessing work. Obviously, COVID completely fast-tracked this for a lot of people. Although cloud computing, being able to work online was a reality before COVID, it wasn't until it became a necessity that it expedited that movement towards remote work.
Yeah, I was remote working back in 2010, 2011, and it was a massive sea change for me then. You didn't have the infrastructure of your local area with Wi-Fi and stuff like that. It wasn't just as available then as it is now. It wasn't as expected. But the difference it made to my life being able to remote work. So my main office was in London and I lived in Dublin. It was awesome. It was such a sea change and you just didn't know yourself. I'd find it very difficult now to do anything but hybrid or remote work. And I can't see that changing going forward. Like, I think that's an expectation of a certain type of worker. There's always workers that won't be able to do it. But of a certain type of worker,
it's funny because
it's the only way to live.
It's funny because the remote working piece is just such a study of psychology and human behavior. And I love where I can't go back to work in an office. I simply love remote working too much. I couldn't stand the commute. I can never go back there again. And then you have these other people who miss the commute because for them it was psyching themselves up to the working day. And then you have these like pseudo commuters who now have created a new habit, a new pattern before they start work, which basically puts a commute into play for that sense of psyching themselves up. So even when I work, I'm hybrid, but even on the days when I work at home, I still leave the house, drop one kid off, grab a coffee, drop another kid off, walk back through the park, and then I'm back at the desk. So it's like my fake commute before I get back to where I started at the beginning of the day from. And then on the days when I do go into work, I'm going into work today. Maybe I'll go out after work. I'm going to grab a nicer coffee here. With the place where I get my coffee from in the morning time, she actually says to me every time I go up there, she goes, "You're not working at home, or you're not working at home today," or "Oh, today's a work at home day today." So the day when I walk up to her and I am going into the office and she says, it must be a work at home day today. That's my cue to go home and get changed and put on more makeup and tidy up my hair, because that's the day she's thinking that I'm like having a sloppy day at home.
I remember in I think it was 2011, 2012 was when I was living in London. It's sort of, there was a bit of virality to this story, but some guy had figured out the best hybrid working situation. So he worked in central London, I think, for a bank. And they basically said at that stage, yeah, look, you can hybrid this because we don't really need you in the office Mondays and Fridays. Fridays are always a bit of a half day in the London fintech community anyway. They're probably out drinking from about 12. And he sort of figured out, well, I'm looking at the cost of rents inside, the commuter belt in central London and the lifestyle that I have there. And he figured out that he could live in Barcelona. He could rent an apartment in Barcelona and he could fly in and out of London every day, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So he would fly in on the 6 a.m. flight. He'd have a little nap on the flight. He'd be into work for 9:15 and he'd fly out again at, I think he got the 7 o'clock flight and he was home for 8:30 or 9:30 or whatever it was that night. And he commuted this 3 times a week. And that's how he lived his life. And when you see the money he was saving and the work he was able to do in the airport on the plane and stuff,
it sounds
he lived
horrible.
that life for a year.
It's
gruesome,
horrible.
isn't it? But
I
he loved
hate that.
But if you're waking up in Barcelona on a Friday morning, you're going down to get your coffee, it's sunny, you can go down to the beach and stuff like that. Is it maybe worth it?
But you're kind of writing off the rest of your week. So for people who have a work-life balance and they might go to the gym in the morning or walk in the evening or play whatever sport they play or meet friends, it's kind of saying these 3 days are just out. I'm a shift worker. It's like working in a hospital overnight and you're sleeping during the day. They're just blocked off. It's a bit too black and white for me in terms of 4 days of fun, 3 days of total gruel, and every day in the airport. What if the flight's delayed? Ugh, no.
But it's horses for courses, right? I mean,
yeah,
so,
true.
I'll be coming down to Dublin tomorrow. I love the way I travel to Dublin now from where I live because I get 2 hours uninterrupted on the train to catch up on emails, do a load of work ahead of the day. I'm not psyching myself up. I'm not sitting there listening to rave music, punching the windows of the train, getting ready to go in. But it does give me time to prepare for my day and do everything. And then when I'm coming back, exactly the same. So I can fill my day with meetings when I'm in the office, be super productive in that way, and then be able to catch up on all my correspondence, emails, or anything I'm working on the way home. So it's a long day, but it's incredibly productive.
The commute impacts your timetable. You're right. You come in and you meet more people and you do all the desk work when you're at home. But let's think a little bit about the people who can't hybrid work. In Ireland, only 30% of jobs are eligible for hybrid working or for remote working because we need to think about the shift workers, the construction workers, retail workers, service industries. So it's not really everybody. We often think people like us who work in tech companies that this is the reality for everybody, but it really, really isn't. And even if you look across your friend groups, you could probably split it out like that. 30% maybe working at home whenever they please, and the others are doing other options there. So the commute is still very much a real thing, albeit the idea of that peak time being a real hustle and bustle has dropped off a little bit with the people that are remote working staying away from those times.
Yeah, and I think you bring the remote working people off the roads and off the peak times. You're exactly right. It makes the experience for the other people and what they're doing that little bit easier.
Less likely to faint on the dirt, for example.
That's you. I mean, let's say that that's not for everyone. But I also think this is where businesses will maybe have to reflect that back as well and say, well, why do I need people in at 9 o'clock? It's a great thing. In London, that was sort of standard in 2011, 2010. It was like, well, you can come in at 8 or you can come in at 10 and you can leave at 4, you can leave at 6, whatever way you do it. And that actually made so much sense for me. I'd be an early riser, so I'd come in early and then I'd leave and I'd be able to go to the gym and stuff in the afternoon before it got busy. It was just an easier way to live. I think in such an intense city like that, businesses, especially tech businesses, started to go, well, we can make this easier for people. We can make this just a better. And I think that's it, down to that commuting experience. I think if you're asking people to take the time to come into an office, you need to think about what their experience is like. And does it really have to be crap? Does that make a massive difference to your business? Or are you going to attract better talent by giving them freedom in their commute and freedom in their working life to make it just a better experience all in all?
More flexibility from workplaces is definitely welcomed by a lot of people. The other thing that has changed a lot over the past decade, which is really welcome too, is this idea of active commute, cycling to work, walking to work, and then the introduction of all the scooters and the one-wheelers. There's a lot more autonomy in how people are getting to work, not restricted by train times and bus times and traffic as it once used to be.
Yeah, that's true. Those one-wheelers are fucking lethal, though. I have no idea how they're fucking lethal. Can I tell you about some new technology that's coming out in the commuting space? So if you think about it, the one thing that you need to do is try and change people's habits. People are very habitual in the way they commute. I have friends here that have been commuting to Belfast and Lisburn exactly the same way as they were doing it 20 years ago, and they will not look outside this. So there's a great little new technology called Pave Commute, and that's trying to, I guess, reshape how people commute, both through a really cool technology that helps them sort of with mobility as a service, but also it looks to incentivize it. So maybe building incentives into traveling in a slightly greener way or traveling with people at different times. It's a very good idea to try and reshape how we think about commuting. And then for the people that do require cars, that need that, there's another new technology called Karma, C-A-R-M-A, Karma, as in, I see what you've done there.
Got it.
But that's about real-time carpooling. So this is about, getting more people into the cars. So more people per car, less cars on the road. And it's not that these are the be-all and end-all, but I think there are new technologies. In fact, there's new opportunities to try and improve how people commute, the experience of their commute, and I guess the productivity of their commute is another way to think about it as well. Why are you commuting this way, and how can you fit your lifestyle into a better commuting structure? What can you do to make commuting better and work for you a little bit more, rather than just trudging like a slave towards the train every morning? What can commuting do for you?
With Karma, can you just explain a bit more? When you get on a train or a bus, there's a lot of people on it, and these are the people you're going to share your journey with. But when you get on Karma, is that not a little bit hit and miss, like a dating app where you could get a really rotten companion? And how do you then deal with that when that happens?
No, you don't need to take in randomers, but there's a couple of things to it. So you can have a social sign-in, so you can have friends of friends of friends or whatever, or neighbors. There's that brilliant image. I think it was on Jim Carrey movie. Is
Karma an app for workplaces then? For people you already know?
It can be for workplaces. Exactly. It can be for workplaces, or it can be for yourself in your own social circle, as far as I understand it. If you look about it, your neighbors are leaving at the same time. Like that was what it was like in the 50s. All the cars pulling out of the driveway at the same time. Whereas now you can say, well, okay, there's a better way to maybe do this. And you need technology to underpin that, because Jimmy's going to this part, Johnny's going to this part of the city. There's just better ways. And I think using technology, using AI perhaps, with your social connectivity that you have via your Facebook or Twitter, that's the way we need to do it. Use both to incentivize smarter travel and probably cheaper travel as well.
For sure.
You sound like you're not convinced.
No, I am convinced. I'm saying for sure, full stop. For sure, full stop. Okay, so we've brought you all the way from ancient Greece to possibly the future of commuting. One thing that is on the cards, there are pilots in cities in North America and in Asia also, is this idea of urban air. So helicopter buses to get you around the city centre. How soon, Phil, do you think we will see these?
You won't see them in Northern Ireland anytime soon. We should have helicopters here. But I think all of that is going to be a long time coming. We just need to optimize the network and structure that we have. We know that it always evolves though. So it just needs to be affordable and not for the hyper wealthy.
Okay, so that is the end of the movers. From me, Sinead Gillett, who commuted to work today, and from him, Philip Macartney, who was wearing his jammies as he is recording this podcast. Thank you very much, and please subscribe to our channel.